morning, world. This is Steve Rao, the host of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition. We greet you live from anywhere you are in the country or world for this wonderful show where we talk about an increasingly turbulent world, politically and economically, innovation, and what we're going to do together as a world to deal with many of the issues we face. I am recovering from a COVID case and I'm quarantined in my fifth day. I apologize for the terrible lighting in the room I'm in, but it'll have to do for today. Today, my monologue is just some insights. I wasn't as well prepared as I normally am because I've been fighting this illness. But a couple of things around the world. There's been a recent assassination attempt on the president of Ukraine, a Russian woman. We're going to talk about that. Niger is still dealing with the coup, and we're going to talk about that. And Indian Independence Day is going to be next week. So we're going to talk about the Republic of India and its largest democracy in the world and where it stands in the world order. And that leads me to my next point, which is Donald Trump, the elephant in the room, and much concern about him being once again indicted. This time, Jack Smith, the independent counsel, and those that are bringing these charges against the former president say that he went against the very bedrock of democracy and tried to overturn the election. He's also facing court charges today in Fulton County, Georgia, for the Georgia elections and what transpired down there. But which leads me to my final point. Through all of the drama of the indictments and charges, one person asked me just a few days ago, can Donald Trump run for president? The answer is yes. There's nothing in the Constitution that prevents a president or former president from running, even if he's charged or convicted of crimes. The second question was, well, if he is convicted, can he serve as the president? And the answer to the question is yes. Donald J. Trump can serve as the president of the United States if he were to be reelected, making him the only president since Grover Cleveland to have a space between his terms. Now, there is one way that Donald Trump can be prevented from regaining the presidency, and it's the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment says that if you take the oath of office of the President of the United States, and then during your term, or you have evidence that you have led or believed in insurrection or rebellion, that you could be removed from office. The challenge with this is that Donald Trump was the President of the United States during the Capitol insurrection, but he's being charged and possibly convicted after the presidency of the United States. There are already states petitioning based on the 14th Amendment that even if Trump were elected, that he could not serve as president, which really makes me wonder what would happen in that scenario. Could we have a president that would be on trial on the day that he was sworn in, and he could pardon himself even from jail if he was put in prison, which is unprecedented. But the most important thing to remember before I close out this monologue is that the president of the United States actually cannot be removed from office while in office, even if he's charged with the crime. In this case, what is different is that he was charged by many of these crimes as a former president, which pretty much puts that rule into a constitutional query. I think this is playing out like a Tom Clancy novel, and we don't know whether it's going to be Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Maybe somebody new will jump in. But I think that Donald Trump today, based on everything that I've seen and heard, will be the Republican nominee for president. The question is, will he be able to continue to serve? Will he pardon himself? And can he be removed from office if elected by the 14th Amendment? More to come on this later today on the show as we talk about this. And I'm going to bring in Mark Lee. We have a special guest. Thank you, Mark.
How you doing? Glad to be here with you. Glad to sorry to see that you're not feeling all that well, but at least you're recovering and all in that space. But you did say that I have a special guest, and I do. And actually, your monologue plays partially into his conversation because he is a historian and a person that has looked at a lot of things. And one of the things that he talks about was the nature of, and it's something you've talked about before. I think Shaquille has brought it up, and Lee Newton Rhodes as well, which is the populist state of not just the nation, but the world. And one of the things that Luke Nichter talks about is how the populism played into some of the early history, even that of the '60s when Nixon was around. So it seems to me, Luke, that what he is talking about, meaning Steve, is a trend that we might have seen even from a historical standpoint. And I know one of the things that your book touches on is some of the conversations that went around the Nixon presidency, and that was around the turbulent time of the '60s when both King and Malcolm X were assassinated, as well as Kennedy and a number of other events took place during that time that might have led to the rise of populism. I have a dear friend of mine that is a big fan of Woodstock and the Woodstock movement, and some people may even say that that was a populist movement, depending on your views of that and all along those lines. But if you can tell us about this book and how maybe even some of the things that took place way back in the '60s may have played into the Trump election. And I would argue, and I've made this argument before on this show, that this whole notion of fighting against the establishment is not anything new, and that a lot of candidates have actually pushed for the agenda of not being the norm in the White House or in the Congress and all along those lines. I would argue that even though he had some political background, that Obama could fit into that narrative as well. And even a president that is currently very sick and many people think is on his last days, that being Jimmy Carter, could fit into that kind of lineup as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. And definitely, as I told you before, I'm very fascinated by this connection between Billy Graham and Kennedy and that secret meeting that went on, and somehow a deal was brokered and all along those lines. But definitely, if you could just share a little bit about your book and the notion of populism that seems to be on a rise, not just here in the nation, but around the world.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I feel like I should hire you both as my publicists. You set it up perfectly, the comparison, without even maybe meaning to, comparing the late 1960s with what's going on today. You know, I'm used to being in the classroom with kind of traditional age college students, kind of 18, 19, 20. And, you know, the way I would set this up for them is to say, you know, I think all presidents are used to governing during some type of crisis. It might be political, economic, social, international, foreign policy. You know, I would argue that you call it the Johnson-Nixon era of kind of the second half of the 1960s into the early 1970s. It's probably a period in time that checks all those boxes. And I think, you know, more recently in our own era, you know, if I can call it the Trump-Biden era, I think we probably check all those boxes too, and maybe even, of course, a public health crisis. You know, Nixon's longtime speechwriter, Ray Price, once told me, if the 1860s was an actual civil war, the 1960s was a kind of proxy civil war. And I think more and more people today say something similar about, you know, our era. You know, I don't, you know, I get asked that a lot, you know, where do we stand the 1960s versus today? I don't think we're quite there. You know, you talk to people who've lived through that era. I'm a little too young. And they'll tell you, you know, the military draft was different, the way that it tore our college campuses apart. It really divided young people and their parents, a generational divide. And of course, you know, compulsory military service in an unpopular war at the time, our nation's longest, is never popular. And then I think I would also add another element, the assassinations. The assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King in April of 1968. Just 2 months later, really surging presidential candidate, Senator Robert Kennedy, just less than 5 years after his brother, President John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. You know, I think there was a degree of severity from that era that we don't quite have today. And I hope we don't get there. But, you know, in lots of other ways, you know, I do think there's similarities. But to give you kind of a brief, couple sentence overview of the book. So it's a book about the '68 election. There are lots of books about the 1960s. I was surprised when I started working on the book. There are actually very few histories that cover kind of all angles, or at least multiple angles, you know, of the campaign, and go all the way from beginning to end. Someone who tried to talk to every person. You know, I had cooperation from all four major sides and talked to the families and former staffers. And so to remind the viewers, that's outgoing President Lyndon Johnson. That's his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who's the Democratic nominee in 1968. That's former Vice President Richard Nixon, as we knew him then, the Republican nominee. And also a really interesting feature of that campaign, former and future Alabama Governor George Wallace. And, you know, running as he's a Southern Democrat, conservative Democrat, but running on a third party which is something we might see again next year. It's something that we only see about once a generation in terms of a third party that really makes a difference potentially. I remember when I vote, I'm always surprised. You see kind of the two major political parties, but then you look kind of deeper on the ballot. There's all these other parties that usually you haven't heard of. Sometimes you have, but a lot of times you haven't. And this day you have to go back to maybe Ross Perot to find a third party candidate who really made a difference in 92 and 96 during Bill Clinton's elections. And so there's a lot that's unusual about 68. It's a fascinating year, as you said, when the nation and the world was being torn apart, not just here at home. And I think has a number of parallels to our era today and as we go from today into 2024.
Yeah, there's a couple parallels.
Are you a professor? Are you a professor, Doctor?
Yeah, I'm a history professor at Chapman University in Orange County, California.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I really appreciate that you bringing these issues up. And when I was trying, I hope I did a good job. I'm not firing on all cylinders today, just recovering from COVID. But what I was trying to say is that it is really historic what is going on. And I think there's a lot of constitutional, processes in play, so to speak, right? And I think I was actually Fareed Zakaria had brought up a good point on yesterday's commentary of what he called the China shock, which was, this whole idea of China overtaking the world and, going to dominate and everything, and how now the U.S. policies, both under Trump and Biden, have really actually worked better for the U.S. with jobs coming back and things like that. And now China's economy is doing terrible, with deflation and lowering prices and slow growth. But he said that we haven't gotten over the Trump shock, which is kind of this nationalist populist movement that the election did not happen, that he was not, Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. And this has just fueled this even more and more. And so it's just really concerning, I think, to see, how unstable this can make us. Even if Trump ran and lost, what if he says, well, the election was denied again, and then it's just the same old thing, right? So anyway.
No, I think you're right. I would point a line back to the Wallace, which was arguably the first, call it an anti-elite, anti-establishment, anti-national media campaign that really, he was on the ballot in all 50 states, which is a really hard thing to do if you're a third-party candidate. The easiest way to make enemies of both sides is try to enter a state and get on the ballot. And you'll immediately it's one of the few issues I think in Washington today that'll bring both parties together is to eliminate third-party challenges. So, and Wallace, didn't use the words drain the swamp, but I would imagine if they had occurred to him, he might have. And as you said in the lead-in, I would argue that populist leaders, everybody says they're an outsider to Washington. Everybody says they want to reform Washington in some way, when in fact, half of them were very much insiders, for much of their career. And you mentioned Jimmy Carter earlier. I would say Bill Clinton is another one. Anyone who kind of runs as a populist candidate on both sides of the aisle. More recently, I would say on the Republican side of the aisle, because Trump is such a powerful personality. But I think that's I think a technique that all populists since Wallace have borrowed from in terms of his style, his rhetoric, and in terms of the voters that he's trying to reach. That kind of, that working class, that white kind of working class, blue collar, call it lower middle class. Those were solid Democratic voters in the entire post-war period. That was, my family growing up was kind of blue collar. I'm not from an elite background. First generation college grad in my family. My grandparents all had pictures of, FDR on the walls and Kennedy on the walls. We were Catholics. And I think those were solid Democrats. And the last Democrat to win them as a voting bloc was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And their votes have been, largely up for grabs since. And I'd call them kind of conservative, but swing voters. I mean, they're all pro-labor. That's the heart of the union membership still. And more recently, I think Donald Trump has probably gone after them more aggressively than any other candidate.
No, I would agree with you on that. Hey, Mr. Nixon, one of the other things there's a couple of things I was curious about, as I mentioned before, but one of the things that I think about, and I'm definitely going to bring up Shaquille, and if Lee wants to come up with him as well, but definitely one of the things I would think about is we think about that insurrection that definitely Steve mentioned earlier, but that is not the first time that there was a insurrection as a child of the 60s, and I was probably only about 6 or something along those lines. And speaking of 68, as I recall, there was an entire takeover of the Democratic National Convention and all along those lines. I do know from watching tape and all in that space, because like I said, it's probably 6 or 7 at that time, the trial of, say, Bobby Seals and other members of the Black Panthers and others that were involved in that takeover. And that became very much of a, what some people would compare this trial to, because it was very much of a show trial. A lot of theatrics were involved, because I think one of the defendants, I can't remember whether it was Bobby Seals or Eldridge Cleaver, was actually muzzled literally in the courthouse and all in that space. So definitely there are some similarities, I would think, to what is going on even with the trials that we are seeing now with Trump. And some of my Democratic friends may be surprised that I make that parallel, but I definitely see the parallel, even though it's from the opposite side. But what is your take on that? Because that is one of the events from '68 that I vividly remember, even though, like I said, it's more of a historical context.
I think you said it really well. I think the late 60s and our own time were both eras that politics becomes a little more brass knuckle, if I can use that term. Whether it's at the convention in Chicago in '68, whether it's the Panthers, as you say, which began in Oakland but quickly became a national movement, or you can find riots, the March on the Pentagon in 1967. And of course, that was much in response to an unpopular war, which is where I guess technically January 6th was during peacetime, although I'm not sure how peaceful our time really is. But no, I think there's a lot of parallels in the sense that people are frustrated, and they're frustrated because our political leaders don't seem to have the answers. Our nation is divided. Our political parties are each divided on the path forward. And I think the lesson of U.S. history going all the way back is that when people get frustrated and our leaders don't seem to have the answers, they sometimes take matters into their own hands. And whether you want to point at that and say that's an evidence of the health of our democracy or dysfunction in our democracy, I suppose it does depend on your perspective.
Just really quickly, and that's the other thing I was going to mention. And by the way, Lee Newton Rose did mention the 4 people from Puerto Rico that shot up Congress, and that was actually more recent, if I remember my history, and all along those lines that took place, and that was another one. But there is a powerful group that is out there now. I think they were a power group then, and you actually, in your book, you talk about that secret negotiation that went on between them. So I just wanted your thoughts in the populist movement of the Christian evangelists, because that is definitely a group that is very prominent in our political figures and all along those lines. And like I said, Billy Graham was a leader. A lot of our political folks would go to Billy Graham to get his endorsement. And I think that this is kind of what happened with this agreement that you were saying took place between Kennedy and Graham in like this backdoor meeting, because we know a lot of times these meetings are held unbeknownst to the general public and all along those lines. So in your research, you found some of this out. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that and the parallels to that movement's power even in today's elections, because you do hear sometimes people will say that they are part of the folks that are mobilizing the morality argument that is going on as well. But I'd just love to hear your take on that.
No, it's a great question. And I wish I could say I was so brilliant to have planned this out at the beginning of the book, but it was a surprise to me. I worked on the book for about 5 years. And in 2018, the Reverend Billy Graham died at 9. And I only learned shortly after that he apparently made plans to begin opening his 70 years of personal papers, which also include his diaries. And so his diaries, to give a kind of a thumbnail sketch, Graham, as you already said, was a friend of presidents of both sides of the aisle. And he kept a diary that he called his VIP notebooks. And it documents, I guess I would call it contact with presidents, their first families, and top staff. And he lived so long. It begins in 1950 with Harry Truman and goes all the way to 2014 with President Obama. And I've only been allowed to see a part of it. And this is the first book, which is kind of the tip of the iceberg that appears in this book. It's really kind of a centerpiece of the the new evidence that's in the book. And in the late 1960s, Graham was really kind of reaching the peak of his power, in his own profession. He had known, I think I calculated all of the political leaders that are in the book, almost 20 years. Former President Dwight Eisenhower, Nixon, Johnson, Humphrey, Wallace, even California Governor Ronald Reagan was kind of an insurgent that year. It turned out to not be his year, but he would come back within a dozen years and win. And what this is fascinating, and it goes way beyond, call it a religious record or an evangelical history. This is someone who had access to what's been called by others the President's Club, which is kind of the idea that while in public they dislike each other, either the current or former presidents, they certainly have political differences, they have party differences, but that in private, it's a different situation, that they come to realize they need each other. They need each other's advice, that only those, who have served in what's been called the loneliest job in the world sort of understand the situation that you're in. I would be fascinated to know if there are private communications between Trump and anybody else, even it seems unlikely. But, here it is 55 years later after 1968, and it could take that long from now for us to know the truth about today. So the Graham diary shows that Graham was a messenger between all these people, and he documented quite a few of those conversations, from everything from the contents of prayer with Lyndon Johnson to messages between Nixon, Eisenhower, and Johnson. And kind of the climax of this in the book is just after Labor Day, 68, which used to be kind of the official kickoff of the high campaign season. Now it seems like we're always in high campaign season.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was different back then. It was really, you had the convention, and then Labor Day, you really got going. And just after Labor Day, Graham carried one of the messages of many that Graham carried from Nixon to Johnson in the Oval Office was a kind of multi-point promise that under a Nixon presidency, still wishful thinking at that point in September 68, before people voted in November, that Nixon would not criticize Johnson as president. He would give him credit for Vietnam once it was all over and settled, that he would consult with LBJ in retirement, and that Nixon would do everything he could to give LBJ a good place in history. And I think that it's remarkable to think, what if that had leaked? I don't know if we could keep a secret like that today with social media, but I think Nixon kind of accurately estimated that was really exactly what LBJ wanted to hear at a time when many in his own party were criticizing him, not just over the obvious issue of the Vietnam War, but also over the Great Society. The nation, people were stirred up. There was unrest. There was crime. People were really stirred up as a result of the Great Society, and criticizing him for that too, that either he didn't fund it properly, that it should have gone much further in its aspirations of transformational change. And so this is, just an incredible act of kind of political marksmanship that goes on. And Billy Graham, while not on the ballot, of course, other than the people who are on the ballot, you've got to put him right up there in terms of the people who were the most influential in that election.
Yeah, no doubt about that. As I said earlier, I'm going to bring up Shaquille, and all along those lines, I know that the populist movement has been one that has spread not just here in the United States, but worldwide as well, because a lot of people will say that is part of what is going on there in Ukraine, that Zelensky is very much of a populist leader, and all along those lines. And I did say earlier that I did see that there was a assassination attempt done by a woman there in Ukraine on Zelensky. But do you see this populist movement spreading not just here in the nation, but around the world? Because that's something that I know we've talked about on the show. Shaquille has brought up some of his thoughts about it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Professor Nichter, as to the populist nature of what is going on a global scene and everything.
Oh, I think it's a trend of populism that I don't know that it translates to every culture on the planet, but certainly among kind of large democracies, it can be an advantage to be an outsider. There's always kind of those who feel left behind. There's always kind of a political underclass. In this country, Nixon coined the term silent majority. He wasn't the first to use that idea. He really goes back to kind of the common man, silent man of FDR's New Deal, which actually kind of goes back to some 19th century poetry. But Trump really tried to openly capitalize on this idea. And I think certainly in other major Western democracies, this has been a very popular concept that appears from time to time, sometimes on the right, sometimes on the left. As they say, politics makes strange bedfellows. But I think absolutely. And I think in the late 1960s, Americans often assume that the United States is the center of the world, but that would be a mistake. I mean, the whole world was undergoing seemingly the same kinds of revolutionary ripples, whether it be the Cultural Revolution in China, whether it be Nigeria, certainly in the late 1960s, the apartheid in South Vietnam. You could look at Mexico City, Western Europe, the streets of Paris, and the student movement, Berlin. So, I mean, this was a year that, while it's a book primarily about the United States and a presidential election, the year 1968, it was a time that the parts of the world were stirred up before the United States and stayed that way long after the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned apartheid in South Africa and everything, but one of the other things that I was curious about is, do you think that Nixon gets enough credit for some of the populist views that he had? And all along those lines, I am family friends of the McKissicks, and they were very big into the enterprise zones, which is something that was taking place in our urban cities, and that was definitely a Nixon initiative. It's the one that I think was a good initiative because it actually increased business opportunities in some of those poor areas and all along those lines. But I don't know that Nixon gets enough credit for that. But I'm just wondering your thought about that.
Well, it's a great question. Actually, I quote, if you look in the index for McKissick, you'll see where I quote him commenting on, it's around May and June of '68. When Nixon, I would call it, makes surprisingly kind of progressive proposals for the cities. It's almost like a Johnson Great Society, but kind of shaded in more of a Republican way. So instead of kind of, aid to families with dependent children, he's talking about things like, tax credits for Black businesses and for cities and investment and home ownership grants and credits. And, it's shaded like in a kind of pro-business way. The terminology sounds more like something to appeal, like he's trying to sell Republicans. But I think one of the results of that is that he convinces Lyndon Johnson that Nixon as president would no more tear apart the Great Society than, say, Eisenhower did, FDR's New Deal. And you look back at what becomes the Nixon presidency. I'm getting ahead of myself. I mean, the book's on '68. He's not president yet. But Nixon, under Nixon, he didn't dismantle the Great Society. The size of government didn't shrink. It grew under the Nixon years. And we look back now at what we would call a pretty expansionary domestic policy for a Republican. But to get to your question exactly, the bottom line, that gives him, we kind of put former presidents in boxes. We kind of stereotype them and we categorize them. But that's what makes it so hard to categorize Nixon. What we're talking about here are not policies that kind of most Republicans would champion and say we're great. Do we call Nixon a rhino now? Some Trump supporters? I'm not sure. He doesn't really fit. He's not really a liberal, like in the Hubert Humphrey sense, but he's not really a conservative either. And when you try to govern as a centrist, you have this very awkward, political balancing act, because I don't think either side really trusts you. And so even today, Nixon's been dead since 1994. It's the same with writing a book like this, because people who pick up a political book kind of want to know, like, where does the central character fit in to kind of our stereotypes? And while Nixon is probably one of the most stereotyped presidents in modern U.S. history, largely due to Watergate, the partisan, the conservative. Herb Block always showed him as kind of someone who crawls out of the sewer, every 2 or 4 years to ask you for your vote. The reality is, I think once you begin to look more under a microscope, it gets harder and harder to stereotype and turn Nixon into the caricature that he often is in history.
Yeah, I'm going to open up the floor to other folks as well. I was just
Shaquille Latimer. Let's get Shaquille. We have Shaquille Latimer on the show. Yeah. He's from Australia, and he also brings a very unique perspective as an analyst on a show to bring it, looking in from, around the world, right? So, Shaquille, what are your thoughts about what Professor said, what I have said, and historically, what we're going through today in the U.S.?
We should bring Lee up, by the way, because he's backstage.
Yeah.
Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Is it Nishta?
My ancestors said that, but it was Americanized to Nictar.
Nictar, okay. So I just want to let you know, if you look at my desk, David Cay Johnston is a guest of ours, so I have his book up here. One of the founders of the network is Nicholas Palavita. I've got his book here. I'm going to turn that focus off. David M. Walker, who'll be on the next show, I've got his book, of course, is America's Superpower. And amongst all the books that I have on the United States, I always buy the books off our guests. And for our audience that's overseas, they should know that your books are actually available with Amazon here in Australia. And I also checked Dymocks, so it's available on there as well. So anyone who wants to read your books, fascinating lineup of books. I must say you've got 5 or 6 there that I saw that I've already bought and I will receive next week, I believe. Look, my comments, look, it's a fascinating history. I think it's important for us to examine what's happened in the past, not just in the United States, but around the world. We can really only judge things based on what we're reading about in history. So, look, a lot of the things that we've seen happen during the 60s, we're seeing again today. Thankfully, we're seeing them without the assassinations that occurred during that era. But, we're talking about populism. We're talking about, a lot of contentious issues today that are the same as what they were, 5 decades ago or 7 decades ago. So, look, I think we can get past it, but I'm actually more fascinated to hear your opinions on things. So I might just leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, and that's Lee, Mr. Nickner, you never did answer that other question, but I'm going to rephrase it again. But I did mention earlier, and we brought it up on this show before, but do you think that the evangelistic movement, because it does seem to be a populist movement as well, is playing in the society? Because I know a lot of people, even Lee, when he's come up before, has talked about the moral breakdown of America. And I think that is part of the populist conversation as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I've just met you for the first time all year online and everything. But I'd love to hear your thoughts around the moral fiber, and if that is part of the conversation that needs to be happening, and if that is a populist conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, and I think it's complicated and it's rich with detail, because when you think of evangelicals as a voting bloc, and I think it would be a mistake to think that they act in unison as a monolith somehow, but you don't. That seems to be the opposite of what you would call a populist movement. I mean, I think the stereotype of evangelicals as a voting bloc is sort of rigid principles that they don't betray. And you say, how could they possibly still be with Donald Trump, after all these years? And it's kind of every fresh indictment that becomes part of the analysis, which is this finally going to show evangelicals that Trump doesn't really reflect their values going forward? But at least so far.
I don't think it will. And I'll tell you why. Because Trump did an amazing job during the election with Hillary Clinton of saying, this is not about left or right. It's not about conservatives versus progressives. This is about us v. them. This is about all of us together, no matter what our politics are, versus the elite political class in Washington. And very interesting, the New York Times, one of the writers of the New York Times, recently wrote an article saying, are we the problem? Or are we the bad guys, I think it might have been. Where he talks about the differences between somebody who's, got a trade, who's working out in the flyover country in the heartland of America, versus the language that's being used by educated people in the cities. And there is a real disconnect. I think that Trump did a very good job of harnessing that. And I think not only is he riding on that wave now, but I think that what he's been very masterfully able to achieve is to say to his supporters, look at what they're doing to me. Right. I didn't do, the records. Okay, that was subpoenaed. He should have given them back. But he's been able to, and Fox News has been able to say, look, this is like getting a fine for not returning a library book, like Seinfeld did in an episode of his. So look at how they're coming after him. Why is Trump up on all these, horrific charges and is going to potentially spend the rest of his life in jail for things that, Hillary Clinton did and Obama did and Biden did? And for a lot of his supporters, most people, regardless of what side of politics you're on, they're not going to understand politics, not going to understand the fine points of politics, not going to understand all the rules and regulations. And I think that Trump has done, and Republicans have done a very good job of saying, hey, look, the Democrats have just, they've weaponized the political system, they've weaponized the Department of Justice, they're going after him, and the more of a martyr he becomes, the more support that he gets. But I'll just say one more thing. You made the comment about, well, is Richard Nixon then, by today's standards, a rhino? I would actually argue probably, and again, it's not my country, but I would argue probably Donald Trump's a rhino, really, because he doesn't really represent conservative viewpoints. He's certainly left of people like Ron DeSantis. So, as a lifelong Democrat, he's not really a Republican. And he's probably the biggest rhino off the wall, in my view.
Well, sometimes you get the impression that what if, sometimes I've thought about that, is that I think he's really been the celebrity president. He came from Apprentice. And so this is actually just what he wants, the drama playing out. He's such a showman. And what if this is like the entire thing is basically an act that he's been told this is the role that you have to play, just like you play for The Apprentice? Because the history does show that when he was in Trump running the Trump organization, he was a friend of the Clintons. He'd written them many, many checks. He'd supported Democratic. He was actually pro-LGBT, even in many of the facilities and buildings that he established. And even other minorities I know who worked in the Trump organization had told me that they were rewarded based on how hard they worked and moved up the organization. So the question is, how could he go from that to now what we see as Trump? So is it just a script?
Steve,
is he just given a script and he's just
Steve, I would argue that he's still LGBTQ positive. He's still a supporter of that movement. He's just not a supporter of the more radical and progressive activist side of that movement. But I'll just say this. I honestly believe, and I've said this from back in 2016, if he just had a little more of a sense of humor, if he just had a little bit more charisma, if he was just 1/20th of the charisma that Ronald Reagan had, he'd be fine. But unfortunately, he just comes across as being quite caustic. And I think when you sit down, certainly for me, when I travel to the United States, and it doesn't matter what state I'm in, when I sit down with people, even people that really don't like Donald Trump, when we talk about policy, most of the time Americans will say to me, yeah, like I kind of agree with that policy, and I agree with this, and for the most part, they can kind of understand the policies, even if they would prefer a different one, but they just don't like him.
Or even
the issue with him.
Or even if he was, completely awful and terrible or whatever, he could take it from the books of, Kevin Spacey, Francis Underwood, and House of Cards, and play it more like, yeah, I'm a gentleman, I'm just doing my job as the president, and then behind the scenes are doing all these things. But he just throws open the heart out there, and to defend. And I think the other side is, to be very honest, as a commentator, we also have to ask ourselves, is this as much the Democrats using it as opportunity for him to not run for president by bringing all these charges and convictions? And I think that's what some Republicans are saying, is that this is just a witch hunt. And we've had witch hunts before, whether it was the Clintons and, all Foulgate, Watergate, Monica Lewinsky scandal, all that stuff. And here we are again. I mean, so.
Well, the Republicans have brought it upon themselves because of what they did to Clinton with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and the fact, like, what Republicans did to Democrats during the Clinton era was awful. And so now they're, 30 years later, 20 years later, now they're wearing the consequences of it. But the problem is that Democrats will be wearing the consequences of what they're doing today in 10 or 15 and 20 years.
Yeah,
so I don't think it's a good way for the United States
because I know that Kimberly, who was off stage, made a couple of comments, and I'm going to repeat them in the words that were given and everything. And then if definitely Mr. Nichter has any thoughts about him. But Kim, who is one of our founders, Nick, who, by the way, is on the panel, is the other founder. But she says that this is about Trump giving millions and trillions of money to the rich man and not requiring them to pay it back. All of Congress who received the PPP loans waived it from being paid back. And she also said, why do you think they did not prove Hillary innocent just because media made her to be a witch that is guilty? Maybe she floated LOL, but they never proved her officially guilty, and she was not a president inciting hate and fear. And he filed bankruptcy 7 times. He's not that great, in addition to the comment she made on the public thing.
But again, But again, as I've said on previous shows, Democrats have got a lot to answer for. You can't sit there for the entirety of the primaries and demonize Hillary Clinton and promote Bernie Sanders and talk about why you should not vote for Hillary Clinton. She's the worst candidate that you could possibly imagine. Then she gets the Democrat nomination, and all of a sudden it's an awful, terrible thing if you don't vote for her. You know, Democrats have got a lot to answer for in the 2016 election. You know, they put this messaging out, not just in America, they put this messaging out all over the world that Hillary Clinton was a terrible candidate, and then all of a sudden she becomes the nominee, and all of a sudden, wow, you're racist and sexist if you don't vote for her. I mean, they set this up for Donald Trump, but again, I will say to your country, you guys need to relax a little bit. Your country's not going to fall apart because you have one person elected to the office of president that you don't like, right? Everyone talked about doom and gloom when Donald Trump won in 2016. Was it really that bad? Right? You might think that COVID could have been handled a little bit better, but COVID affected the whole world. Left-wing and right-wing politicians run other countries. America didn't do that much worse or that much better than anybody else. So, you know, what exactly is everybody so worried about? And what the problem is that today you've got people talking about Joe Biden and talking about Donald Trump. Okay, the person who has the power of the executive is really important in your country, but ultimately what it really comes down to is policy and who's in charge of Congress and who's in charge of the Senate. And so this sort of personality politics, you know, who cares about who's... I'm not saying who cares about who's there, but, you know, who really cares that much about the personality differences between Biden and Trump or any other candidate? What should matter is what the policies are and how it's going to affect the future of America and potentially affect the future of the Western world.
Hey, Professor Mitchell, you mentioned it earlier, and I'd love to hear your thoughts because we brought it up on this show several times in different shows and different people, including Shaquille and Lee. And I want to hear if Lee's got some thoughts, and Nick as well. But you mentioned the third-party candidates, and there is a person connected with our network that is part of the No Label Party, and all along that line, that being definitely David Walker and all in that space. But what is your thoughts about a No Label Party? And along those same lines, and to Shaquille's point, every election, I agree with you that they are people that are saying that if their candidate loses, they're going to automatically, and we don't have Sasha here, but they're going to move to Canada, they're going to move to wherever they're going to move. But a lot of times it is empty talk and empty rhetoric because most of the people I know don't necessarily.
Well, how many Americans moved up to Canada after Donald Trump won? They all said that we're going to move. Snoop Dogg said he was going to move. What happened?
I'm going to move to Australia.
Newport Beach.
If he wins, I'm going to move to Australia.
Leave.
We'll be neighbors.
That's kind of my point, is that people say that, but then they don't necessarily do it and everything. But Mr. Nichter, what is your thoughts about the third-party candidates? Is it possible that this could be the year or the decade that it is actually successful? Or as some of our people have said on the panel, it is in the past, including some that are not here, that it is more on the local level that we can see success there. We know that definitely in Minnesota, we saw the success of a former wrestler, and he ran as a third-party candidate and became their governor, that being Jesse Ventura, and all in that space. But do you think that we'll ever see a national politician that is able to be that third-party candidate?
Well, there's no question that right now we have, call it a third party or a third candidate, that we have an energy that we haven't seen for a while, an alternative to the two major parties. You know, I would say, you know, anyone considering being a no labels, third party, third candidate, whatever you call yourself, I think the handbook of George Wallace is instructive here, 1968 in the book. And by that, I mean, you know, the hardest part of that kind of a campaign is getting on the ballot in all 50 states. And Wallace managed to do that, to navigate 50 sets of state laws, legal challenges, and managed to do that everywhere but the District of Columbia. In Washington today, I don't think there are very many issues, natural issues, that bring together both parties. I would say probably concern over China, concern over social media, maybe Ukraine, concern over AI. But third-party challenges, no one wants, you know, in any state. And so for me, we've got a lot of rumblings of third-party challenges in 2024. The question is, are they a real candidate? And it takes time to figure that out. What do I look for? If they can get on the ballot like Wallace and truly have a national message and organize around a meaningful national theme, I think those are the ones to watch for 2024.
Lee and Nick, any thoughts and everything along those
Yeah,
lines?
I have a question for Luke. First of all, welcome to Pod TV. You mentioned about getting on ballots in 50 states. In the age of where everything is tabulated manually, I get that restrictions who can get on. But now that we have computers and the internet, and things are not done manually except maybe paper ballots on the local level, why does it have to be any requirements that people need filing fees, number of signatures, or what have you? Why can't Mickey Mouse or whomever run for president, and whoever gets the most, and within each state with electoral colleges, win the presidency? Why do we have to have any requirements? Isn't that the system itself restricting, and the system selecting who we can vote for, as opposed to we the people selecting who we can vote for?
Well, first of all, Mickey Mouse might get my vote next year if these are the alternatives that we have. But I think it's in the interest of the two parties to cooperate, to collude, if you like that word.
But it's not the interest of the people, though.
But there's still statutes they have to navigate. Wallace, for example, it wasn't just signatures or fees. I believe the state of California, for example, was one of the worst, where he had to apply a year in advance, and he didn't just need signatures, but every person who signed had to fill out a 2-page application to join a new political party. It was a huge hurdle, not the money or the signatures, but what you were asking of people who were willing to sign. And so that's the challenge, is Wallace hired dozens of young attorneys, so fresh out of law school, they didn't know better, and they hadn't gotten in trouble yet. And they divided the country up into regions, and they figured out how to tackle this. And so whoever's running as a third-party candidate or independent or whatever it might be, no labels in 2024, they need a similar technique as George Wallace to figure this out.
But is there any reason that it should be that way? To me, that seems so un-American.
Well, I think philosophically, I'm right there with you.
Thank you.
I would imagine that the age on some of these statutes goes back not just decades, but maybe 100 years or more. I mean, that the laws have changed.
Yeah. Nick, any thoughts on everything?
A quick question. When you're doing your research on the Nixon tapes, did you ever come across Bill Saxby, who was the Attorney General of the United States back then?
Saxby does come up, but he's later in the administration, and taping ended in July of '73. They kind of pull the plug on the system because they're concerned they're recording potentially more evidence every day that could be used against them. And Saxby, as Attorney General, comes in kind of late in the administration, so his name does come up in kind of other contexts, but I would say not as a substantive figure, since taping ended. We don't have the final year or so of the Nixon presidency taped.
Yeah, along those lines, I know that Saxby is actually related to Nick. I think that he is second cousin and all along those lines.
So I was just curious, and I knew Bill years ago. He's passed on since then, but I was wondering if he ever came up during that your research.
And I actually had a question, Mr. Nichter, about a person that is in my life as well. I don't have that same kind of conversation as Nick, but they were one of my professors, and I actually had a great deal of respect for them. So I was just wondering, because I mentioned it to you in the emails that we had going back and forth, if you had the privilege of talking to, or dealing with any research around George Reedy, who was the press secretary of LBJ and was one of my professors at Marquette University. So he's one of my professors at that particular university.
His name comes up a few times, but it's superficial under Nixon. It really comes up, of course, under LBJ. Right. Most authors kind of move forward in time with their books. I'm kind of sticking right in the 60s and moving backwards. My next book is going to be LBJ White House years, on the assumption that Robert Caro doesn't finish the series. And so Reedy is right in the heart. I'm in the process of going through his personal papers now. So you're exactly right. He is an important figure for that entire time period.
What do you think is one of the biggest lessons? You mentioned it.
To seeing those books, but I'll just say very quickly, you made a comment just while I was away, sort of about the division in the United States. I'll just say, Americans, I'm not talking about present company, but Americans often focus on America. They don't look at things from an international perspective. And I think that gives Americans an illusion of division that actually isn't really as true as people think. The reason why people think America is so divided, which it is in part, is because it's what divides you guys that you talk about. if you think about things like republicanism, I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans. I'm talking about republicanism as opposed to rule by monarchy. I've been to 27 states in the United States. I can't recall a time that I've ever met an American who would say to me, we would prefer it if the British royal family was in charge of the United States, right? Most people believe in a system where the people get to decide who the head of state is. They might have some issues with how that, how elections are run or how that process works. But the fundamental idea that the people of the country get to decide how the country is going to run is something that is actually unifying premise of the United States. But because it's a unifying premise of the United States, nobody talks about it. And there's a heap of things within American politics and American history where the things that actually unify the country, the things that the values that Americans have, those sort of standard American, these are the values that we push out across the world, those things that your foreign diplomats will push are the things that are rarely talked about within the United States. And I think that the everyday person walking down the street, whether that person be a Democrat or a Republican, an independent, whoever they are, gets the impression that America is way more divided than it actually is. Do Republicans go and buy the cookies from the Girl Scouts at the shopping center? Of course they do. Do Democrats go and buy the cookies from the Girl Scouts at the shopping center? Of course they do. There's so much stuff, the future of America, the way that children are treated, etc. Most things in the United States, people are unified. But it breaks my heart, but Americans don't see that. All Americans see is those things that, I don't agree with this, or I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that book being taught. I don't agree with this, the trans lobby, whatever it is. These are things that get talked about. These are things that the media talks about. And it's unfortunate to see that.
But Shaquille, to that point, and I'd love to hear Professor Nichter's thoughts about this and everything. When it comes to the politics, they do look at the dividing factors, and I'm not even going to go down the racial line, which may surprise some of the people on this panel. But if you look at a election in any state, in any part of the United States, don't they look at a ways that it is divided on a urban and rural and that suburban level? Because I know that all the candidates are trying to win the suburban mom. They're trying to make sure that they are addressing the rural issues around the farmers and that line. And then they're trying to make sure that they are winning and captivating the urban core and all in that space. So I think that is any politician that goes on and everything. But I'd love to hear Professor Nichter talk about that.
It doesn't have to be that way. And I'll hand it to Professor Nichter for this. But if you look back, again, regardless of who you agree with or disagree with historically, if you go back and look at the election debate between Richard Nixon and JFK, what a beautiful debate. They were so gentlemanly and so stately and so polite to each other. They put forth their arguments. They talked about why the other person's arguments were not, or the other person's positions were not the right way forward in their opinion. They complimented each other for being passionate and patriotic people. It was a polite, wonderful debate. I think anybody who watches the Richard Nixon JFK debates would sit there and go, wouldn't it be fantastic if politicians debated like that today?
It might have
been that's what I'm saying. I think
that
whilst there may be a lot of division, and it always has been, it doesn't need to be as venomous as it has been in recent history. Professor Nichter, over to you.
Professor Nichter, just really quickly on that debate, because I hear what Shaquille said, and I've heard Shaquille say this before, and I'm not saying that it is as virile, and it definitely has that kind of attacking nature as some of the more recent debates, but there were some parts of that debate that were not as friendly from my understanding of the debate and everything. And there were some things.
Have you watched? What do you mean by your understanding? Have you watched the debate?
I've watched the debates, and yes, I have watched it. And I'm going to let Professor Nichter talk about it as well, because there are some things that were going on in that debate.
What part of it has anything in common with the absolute debacle between?
I just said that it was not in common. Hold on a second, Shaquille. I just said it was not in common, but I'm saying that there were some things about that debate that were not as friendly, and to those that are students, and I'd rather hear Professor Nichter's thoughts about this, but I have talked to others that are in the historical lanes, and they do bring up some of the things that were said or alleged, or a number of other things that were not as friendly. But Professor Nick, I'd rather hear your thoughts because you are the person that has done the studies of that. Neither me or Shaquille, we may have watched it, but you are the one that is the student. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that particular debate.
Well, I try. I can barely make sense of the past. I certainly can't make sense of the present, but I try. Those debate, even that 60 debate between Kennedy and Nixon, I would say you look at even the American style of debating isn't exactly something you'll find at, the Oxford Union. I mean, it's a little different. I think our style of debating is sort of more like competitive press conferences. And you look at that 60 debate, Nixon often, when you see him pictured, was looking at Kennedy, was kind of, he thought his audience was Kennedy. But Kennedy understood the real audience was looking into the camera. The real audience was sitting at home in their living room. So I would agree it was a mostly cordial debate. Neither side wanted to appear to be a bad guy, but there were some stylistic and messaging differences. But I think Shaquille's analysis is really interesting. As someone who understands different kind of political systems around the country, would look at the United States and say, but the two political parties aren't even really that different. We don't really have a true party of the left. We don't really have a conservative party, even though we use those labels. They use them toward each other. I think part of our infighting is because they're so similar in many ways. Nixon once said about going to China in 1972, the reason why it's easy to go to China in 1972 is we don't know each other. There's so much to talk about. Everything is new and exciting. But he said it'll become difficult in the future once we get to know each other. They said it's like a family. When you meet someone for the first time, it's easy to talk to someone if you enjoy a good conversation. Families have some of the worst fights because we know each other too well. And then finally, I would say, if you go back and look at some of the writings of the founders of this country, James Madison is one that comes to mind. James, this is a country that was we talk about violence today in America. This is a country that was born in violence, that's had violent episodes in many times. You go back to the 19th century, you can have someone caned almost to death on the U.S. Senate floor in the 19th century, just before the Civil War. I mean, it's easy to look at today and look at everything's an aberration, but I think history can be instructive and can show you that, we have been divided at other times, and it has been violent, and it has been, this visceral. And I think James Madison and some of the other founders would say that evidence of this divide and is actually a sign of our health, of our democracy. It doesn't seem like that some days, doesn't seem like that to me. But I think, the other way to look at it, glass half full or half empty, is that our division might not really be disorder. It might, in a way, a dysfunctional way, perhaps, be a sign of the health of our democracy, that we can exchange ideas this way. And also, I think the lesson of 1968 is we survived. We got through that as a nation, and there's an ebb and a flow in history, and we transitioned to a calmer period. I hope we get to that calmer period today, sooner rather than later. But I think there's a lesson that, it took 55 years now for us to look back and have a conversation about what really happened in 1968. I hope I'm around and it doesn't take that long to talk about IRR today, but we'll find a way to get through this, most likely.
Yeah, definitely.
People often talk about these issues as if they're so far apart. And I often hear from people in America saying the Democrats are going to destroy the Republic. Yep. They hear Democrats say Republicans and Donald Trump, they're going to destroy the Republic. But, one only has to have a look at what happened during the 1800 election. Let's see how tumultuous that was between Jackson and Adams. And 1876, it must have been an even number. 1876, where dual electors were sent to Congress. What happened? Abraham Lincoln ended up with that election with less than the popular vote, and 36% of people. America's been here before. I really don't think that America's on a downward spiral.
Folks, we want to thank you for a wonderful show. I want to thank
being on.
I want to thank Luke.
If Luke wants to give his ways that he can be reached, we'd love to have you come back whenever you're available. I was glad to reach out to you through some of your publicists and all along those lines, and I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation, and we'll make a return trip because we do like getting a historical perspective as well. So if you can tell folks how you can be reached, and then Steve will do the closeout as well.
No, I'd love to come back, and you provide a great public service, and you also got a little deep, which I appreciate. I mean, we got into some issues which I think are worth getting into. Easiest way to get a hold of me, Google me, LukeNichter.com, LukeNichter.com, and I'm pretty easy to get a hold of, and I love to hear from folks, and I'd love to be back.
Well, folks, thank you so much. We'll be reaching out to you, Professor. Love to have you come back as a frequent on this show. As I close out, I will just say that we're living in interesting times. The next few months will be very interesting as we continue to see the presidential elections unfold. We're monitoring the Trump situation very closely. We'll also talk about the Ukrainian assassination tomorrow and other things going on in the world. And just a shout out to Megan Rapinoe at Team USA. It was heartbreaking to see her lose her last game with a missed penalty shot, but she had a great career. We wish her well. And Simone Biles is back and inspiring that after taking 2 years off mental health, she's going to be competing again in her sport. We'll talk about that next week, tomorrow. Thank you all so much, and we'll be back tomorrow for another edition of World Edition. I will not be back until Wednesday, but Mark Lee will be running the show tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Be safe wherever you are. Thank you.